Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Chris Gilmore, VP of Education Dynamics Enrollment Management. Chris has spent his career in online higher education and held various leadership roles in enrollment management, student services, and program development. Chris joins us today to talk about the enrollment strategies that higher ed institutions must use when focusing on non-traditional students, those students who are fitting the degree into their life versus the traditional age students whose primary focus is their education, and how you might want to consider changing your enrollment strategies for this demographic. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
My pleasure. We're going to have a great conversation today. Before we get into it, you work with Education Dynamics, which is one of those really great firms that works with non-traditional students. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got here, your background, etc.
Yeah, sure. I am with Education Dynamics. I'm the vice president for our enrollment management area. I oversee all of our student coaching operations. I've been with Education Dynamics in that role about 6.5 years, but I've spent my entire career, for the most part, working with non-traditional students, mostly in enrollment management, both on the new and continuing side of the student experience, on enrollment management, as well as campus operations. So prior to joining Education Dynamics, I've mostly been on the university side of things, but now in my current role, really enjoy to be on the other side of it, working with several university partners to help optimize the experience of their non-traditional students.
Mm-hmm. And just so that listeners understand, what are the differences between what we call traditional and non-traditional students?
Yeah, that's a good question because that's really changing. It used to be, had you asked me that a couple of years ago, I probably would have pointed to the age difference as the primary differentiator between traditional, which we would have defined as that kind of typical out of high school 18 to 22-year-old age demographic, versus non-traditional, which historically was, mid-30s, person who's already, in a career field, but maybe wanting to do a little bit more in their current career or likely wanting to transition in their career. Now, though, over the last couple of years, we've seen that demographic really change a bit to where I personally am not defining it so much based solely on age range, because we're seeing younger and younger students that are enrolling in full-time online programs. And I think their reasons for that are varied, but a lot of it is just the desire of the modern student is fitting school in with an already very full life. And to me, that is a non-traditional student. It's anybody who life is not fitting into school, it's school that is fitting into life. And that can be the case for a 20-year-old, and it certainly can be the case for a 36-year-old who's working full-time and has a family.
That's interesting that you put it in that perspective. What that reminds me of is the current Gen Z is work fits into their life and their lifestyle, not lifestyle works around work.
Very, very much. Yeah, good point. That's a great example. And I think the same thing, not limited to Gen Z, of course, but across all age demographics, there's been that transition more broadly to I need to fit this into the other things that I have on my plate.
Mm-hmm. And that makes perfect sense. But higher ed is hitting troubled waters at this point. We all know about the demographic cliff or the enrollment cliff that's coming up as a result of the Great Recession back in 2008. That is leading to a reduction of the, quote, traditional students, the out of high school moving directly to college. There's also a public perception of higher ed not being worth it, and the cost has gone up significantly. This is forcing many higher ed institutions to change their focus. Instead of looking toward the traditional students. Colleges, universities shifting their focus to beyond just the traditional students and going to the non-trads.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I would say that the vast majority of traditional universities have, to some extent, noticed this market and been somewhat focused on this market over the last decade. And certainly there are exceptions to that, but I think they have noticed this market over the last decade. But where I think you'll see an increased urgency now is, to your point, with some of the changes in the challenges, the demographic cliff, the perception challenges, in particular around traditional higher education. It's no longer a luxury to just think about the non-traditional student. You better be working it into your strategy, because unlike the traditional age students, which, as you reference, the enrollment potential there is decreasing, there's an exponential opportunity for schools to do better with what we'll broadly call the non-traditional student. But this is just really, I'm trying to get in the habit of transitioning to say, this is just the modern student. This is the student that has other priorities, but needs to view completion of the degree as attainable and doable within their current life. I've definitely seen an increase in traditional universities understanding that they need to factor that student market, that portion of the market, into their enrollment strategy, more so than they have in the last 10 years.
And you're right. I've seen it. You've seen it as well. But I always fall back on the consulting model. When you're bringing a new client on, it's much more difficult to bring that new client on than to sell repeat business with a previous client. You already know that client, you know what's going on, et cetera, and you can help them in multiple ways, hopefully. Universities haven't been thinking along these lines. They have been thinking about one and done rather than lifetime learning. I mean, there's two examples that come to mind that are doing this really well. Michael Crow at Arizona State. They're looking at lifetime learning through certificates, graduate studies, et cetera. And then you have Melek Khoury at the Unity Environmental University up in Maine, yes, who has separate divisions. He's changed the business model to where he's got face-to-face, he's got online, which is the majority of his things. And they have, when he took over 7 years ago, they had 500 students. They're up at 7,500 and expect to get to 10,000 within the next 2 years. I mean, to me, those are success stories that they're viewing higher education not as a one and done, but as a continuous education throughout life.
Yeah, great examples. I agree with both of those. We have the privilege of actually partnering with Unity Environmental University over the last several years, and it's been incredible to watch them grow. And a big reason of it, I think, a big reason behind that, I think you articulated really well, is how they've approached the business model of higher education. You referenced lifelong learning, and that is so core to the non-traditional student experience. I think it's of the utmost urgency that universities are really examining how they can make progress towards that. And some of the examples that I would point out are when universities are considering working better with the non-traditional student market, the modern student, who again needs to view school as achievable and attainable without sacrificing everything else that they have going on in their life. You really have to approach that from a lifelong learning model. And that means that these students need to see that they have entry points to the university, but also tangible exit points too. And they may step in and step out, step back in, step back out, and that is okay. And we should be set up to support that with products that help them mature along the student life cycle. So certificates, both for credit and non-credit, I think is a big thing. On the marketing side, we see year over year demand for certificates has been increasing. Modern students want to be able to take, for lack of a better words, a bite-sized chunk out of higher education that they can feel is doable in a certain time length, that I can then go out and directly apply and receive some of that benefit that I wanted when I considered this program. Certificates are fantastic ways to do that. And there's a lot of innovation going on too between embedding these certificates into degree programs, whether that's starting at the associate's degree, bachelor's degree, graduate degree. There's really no reason that schools shouldn't be innovating here to make sure that the modern student who takes a certificate here is well incentivized down the road to apply those 12 credit hours from that certificate rolling straight into their graduate degree program. And if they have a good experience at the university, they're very likely to do that. And that is one of the things that we talk with university partners a lot about is you got to really optimize your engagement and your enrollment experience for these students, but you also have to optimize their continuing student experience. And when we do that, these students aren't wanting to go out and shop for schools over and over again. If they completed a graduate certificate with you and they had a good experience and it's embedded and there's some incentive for them to apply those credit hours to a graduate degree program, you got a good shot at bringing them back time and time again. And we should celebrate that.
Absolutely. There's two things that you said that I want to key in on. One is you used the term product. Okay. That is a change of mindset that higher education hasn't fully adapted, or I would say even mostly adapted at this point.
Yeah.
You're offering products to the marketplace. You have consumers out there. It's a different mindset, but it's something that I think higher ed needs to catch up with versus, taking the lead, because your customers, your students are already thinking along those lines. What's in it for me? What's my return on investment?
Oh, 100%. I use product. And what I have seen is over the decades plus that I've, used that phrase, I'm shocking fewer and fewer academics with that word. So I do think we're making progress on viewing it that way. But there are just so many data points that really support viewing it that way. One of the things Education Dynamics does every year is we do a really exhaustive report on the modern student, the online college student report. And it's just a collection of data around marketing, how do online college students think, what's their consideration process, pre-enrollment, application, everything like that. Super valuable. One of the things that I feel like is really, really reinforced every year here is that for the modern non-traditional student, the value propositions need to be very clear. So they are very much making a purchase decision. And in order to do that, they need to understand a few basic things. Is this product likely to get me into the field that I want to transition into, or further along in the field that I already am? Is this product capable of getting me there sooner rather than later? And can I afford to cover the cost of this product while I'm enrolled at whatever rate they have targeted is acceptable to them? Those three things, those are really all about making decisions around the purchase of a product. So the university course, especially when we're talking about lifelong learning, certificates and degree programs and everything like that, those are our products. And we really, really have to be talking about the value proposition of our product line and making sure that we have a very diverse product line. To your point, these students may jump in, they may jump out, they may complete the certificate, they may complete a non-credit course, and that is great and fine. And we need to have a diverse product line to support that.
Mm-hmm. And it also, I feel like we're getting off our topic, but I think this is really important. Institutions need to change how they are thinking about developing these, quote, products. First off, higher ed has good credibility. If they're developing products within the ivory towers and they're not reaching out to the employers to say, what is it that you really need in this area? That's a big mistake. Second, if in fact there's just saying, yeah, go out and develop this certificate program, but you don't have any cost guardrails around that, how are you going to gain a return of investment? So I think
Yeah,
institutions have to think about these things very differently than they have in the past.
absolutely. Yeah, especially on the bringing employers to the table. That's one of the value propositions that needs to be really clearly articulated to the modern non-traditional student is a connection with employment and job outcomes. What better way to do that than to make sure that we're developing curriculum and programs in partnership and collaboration with employers?
Absolutely. And you and I, when we chatted yesterday a little bit about this, we talked about Franklin University in Ohio, and they are doing these very things with their degree programs and their certificates.
Yeah, absolutely. Franklin's a great example. And there are several really great examples of schools that are bringing employers to the table, forming these partnerships that aren't just a partnership on paper. They're a partnership that feeds both the inputs of curriculum development and then 2 years later down the road feeds the outputs of graduates being better equipped to be a viable candidate for these positions at these companies. Lots of
Mm-hmm.
schools are doing it. Unfortunately, that stuff doesn't usually make the headlines within higher education. We're in a bit of more of a doom and gloom cycle. But yeah, there's tons of examples of really great innovation going on there.
So, if an institution wants to branch out to attracting more non traditional students, what are the things that they need to think about? Because we know, you and I both know, that doing enrollment for traditional students is very different than that of the non traditionals.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good point. For traditional students, these schools have largely written the book and they're doing well with it, but diminishing returns, as you referenced earlier, with demographic shifts and things like that. When they look at how to more effectively engage a non traditional student, a more modern student, I tend to think of three areas of advising these schools. You need to really look at how are you attracting these students, how are you enrolling these students, and how are you persisting these students. And so for attracting these students, I think a good starting point is some of the data that we have around how these students make their decisions. 90+% of students, of non-traditional modern students, are starting their search on Google, not surprising, and they are ending up on our websites. They are doing quite a bit of independent research before they make the decision to engage with the university. And this is one data point that I track a lot year over year. And 4 or 5 years ago, we were seeing that non-traditional modern students typically were requesting information from 3 to 4 institutions. That is down to 1 to 2 institutions. To me, that tells me one big thing. They are spending a lot of independent research time out there on our websites primarily. So first and foremost is we need to view our EDU pages, our websites, as a marketing tool for non-traditional students. And in order to make that an effective marketing tool, we have to understand what's important to these students when they're in the attraction phase of the funnel. And
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, we have a lot of data on that too. These students are interested in things that wouldn't shock you. They want to understand, is this program likely to help me achieve my career outcome? And of course, everybody has different career outcome aspirations, but if your website is not effectively communicating the value proposition of employment outcomes, highlighting where your alumni are, if you happen to be one of those schools that's innovating, bringing employers into the curriculum development, articulating that in your website, we really need to give that confidence there when they're doing this independent research. The other thing is price and affordability. And those are not necessarily the same thing. And students need to understand both. And non-traditional modern students want to be able to easily find price on our websites. And the vast majority report that they cannot easily do that. That's very frustrating. You think of a buying decision and a buying process for any other standard product where the price is very difficult to find. What do? We close out and move on to the next one. It's not incumbent on me to force your system to tell me how much it costs to buy this product. But yet we don't necessarily do the best job of that in higher education. And the non-traditional students really describe that. So we need to be making sure that our value propositions are clearly articulated on our website. We need to understand that the website is a marketing tool, and we need to be very attractive during that attraction phase of the funnel. Because once we get them there, we know that students are now only requesting from 1 to 2 schools. So I talk to our partners a lot about, if you get a student that's come into your funnel, there's a good chance that they've already identified you meet some of their core criteria. But we now need to be in the engagement process. And that also looks a lot different than working with traditional students too.
Mm-hmm. It's got to match their area of interest. They've done their research already. One of those key things for them is what you talked about, is affordability and a return on their investment. If they go back and get this advanced degree, if they go back and get a certificate, whatever, how is it going to help them? I mean, years ago, it used to be you'd go back to school to complete your degree, to get a promotion or get higher pay. I don't think those have basically changed, but I think the buyer now is far more discriminating. They want to see how much it costs. They want to see what the return is and what are the outcomes. I think your idea of listing what some of your graduates are doing and where they've gone is important for them to identify with somebody who's already gone through the program.
Yeah. There's so much that's changed in higher education over the last 20 years. But from the time that I first started working directly with students, one of their most important points of concerns pre-application and certainly pre-enrollment is, this going to get me where I want to go? Am I going to be able to afford it? Can I do it in a timeline that works for me? Those are still primary drivers of non-traditional student interest. And so we as institutions and as good partners to our institutions really have to be pushing, clearly defining those things for these non-traditional students in particular. When they enter into our funnel, request information, it also is a big difference too in terms of now we're looking at engaging this student. We've won a significant part of the battle. We got them to request information from us, probably only doing that with 1 or 2 total schools. But when we have those admissions conversations, our admissions and enrollment staff, our admissions professionals that are speaking with these prospective students, they also need to be thoroughly trained on the motivators of these students and be able to articulate the specific and unique value propositions that these students are concerned with. So that to me says we need to be really focused on training and developing these teams, these employees, to fully understand the employment market associated with the programs that they're representing, to be able to have those kinds of conversations with students and help them understand their concerns and that these programs are associated with the outcome that they're looking for. In terms of price and affordability, that's another big one too. I often reference the data point that when it comes to non-traditional students, it's a very price sensitive market. But we have a lot of data that shows that they are not necessarily going to go with the lowest cost provider if a higher price provider checks the other boxes for them. Those other boxes for them are very important. So if you're a price leader, that's fantastic. I think we should all be very focused on what we can do to limit the cost of a credential. And if you're in that boat, fantastic. If you're not, and you're somewhere in the middle of the pack, and certainly if you're on the higher end of pricing consideration, your teams all the more so need to be trained on the value propositions of the program and what specifically differentiates it that should factor in the student's decision making.
I don't want to gloss over this one point that you just made about training your admissions staff to have these outcome conversations. This is important. And it's very important because your traditional students, they think about these things to some degree, but not to the same degree that your non-traditional students do. Is that a fair statement?
Sure, absolutely. Your traditional students, often I think we have a FAFSA default for them. We're going to point you this way. And, the vast majority of them that works for. But your non-traditional students, just by proxy of who they are and what they have going on, pricing and affordability, those mean different things.
And so I think we fleshed out the attracting piece really well. There's two other pieces to that. There's the enrollment or the engagement piece, and then there's the persistence and retaining. How do you get students, the non-traditional students, how do you move them into the recruitment and enrolling from the attracting?
Yeah, good question. Because I think this is also really different than how you do the same things with traditional student demographics. For non-traditional, more modern students, we talked a bit about the training and development aspects for the team that's going to be speaking with these students. And I can't enforce that enough. It's critical that they understand the motivators of this market and that they're able to go conversationally where this student needs them to in order to help them understand and make a fully informed decision. The other thing, too, is just how we're engaging with this market. Historically, higher education we can dabble in a bit of a gatekeeping mentality of, we're
Really?
higher ed. And,
I've never heard of that.
not sure if you've heard of that yet, but, students will find us and this is our process and this is how we work, and they will have to jump through those hoops if they want to attend here. The opposite is how we need to be thinking about non-traditional modern students. And that is, these students are busy. They are highly informed consumers. They have already done a bit of independent research before they've engaged with us. And so once we are talking about actually engaging them in the funnel, it is all about how and when that student chooses to engage with us. So we talk a lot about the important aspect of speed. That's another thing higher education historically has not been a leader in, speedy processes. But when that student makes the decisions to inquire, we need to have the systems and the platforms and the staff to respond to them quickly, to offer them multiple channels of engagement too. So these students may request information at 1:30 in the afternoon. When we call them at 1:32 in the afternoon, they don't answer their phone. And that's okay, because we want to be able to communicate them in a channel that they are comfortable with. So are we quickly sending them out a text message and letting them know that we're there via text? Are we active in a chat communication channel that they can engage via chat or via email? And we really need to be optimized in all of those channels so that when and how that student chooses to engage with us, we're still ready to conduct the full student experience there. And if you want to do that via text, let's do the majority of this via text. And if phone works better for you, well, then we can jump on the phone for that. But it's just important that we're really thinking of how and when they want to communicate and that we are optimized in whatever channel that is.
And one of the things that really blows me away about the modern student is they make their decision. They've already done their research. They make their decision for enrollment or not within 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And that most go with the first institution that accepts them.
Yeah.
This blows
sense.
me away. Well, it does, because they've got lives, and you're fitting into their lives, not.
When we make a purchase decision, independent of higher ed, you think of any purchase decision. Once we get to that decision point, don't you want to get on with it? Most of us do. I do. And I think non-traditional modern students are very similar to that. The data says, to your point, within 2 weeks, they are often making these application and enrollment decisions. 80+% of them will ultimately choose to enroll at the first institution that admits them. And a significant majority of non-traditional students have an expectation that they will actually begin their courses within 30 days of their admit. Mm-hmm. So everything is about speed. And so that speed has to be applied to every part of our process as higher education institutions as well. So when I talk about engaging them, it's a quick response. When I talk about engaging them, it's multiple modalities and channels that we're working with. But also, once we connect with them and actually move them into the application funnel, You really articulated a very powerful data point to me, which is also that 80% of them want to enroll at the first institution that admits them. And in order to be that institution, we need to be the first one that admits them. And we are not always quick at that. And that's, a very unique to higher education thing that we have a customer knocking on our door saying, can I do business with you? And we take multiple weeks to say, sure, here's your opportunity. But it's really looking internally at our systems and our processes, our SLAs for how quickly we can turn around admit decisions, and really selling the why to sometimes our internal stakeholders on why it's critical that we're able to do this in a timely fashion. Because if we don't, we might not necessarily have the opportunity to enroll the student.
Mm-hmm. So the era of, we'll take this to our enrollment committee and we'll get back to you in 5 weeks or 7 weeks. If you're looking to enroll non-traditional students, you've got to redo your business processes to make sure that folks can enroll within 3 or 4 days, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that.
So the last piece of this, it's the persistence, it's the retention of the students. Trads are different.
They are. Their risk profile is different just by proxy of who they are and what they're doing. They have a lot of plates that they are balancing, and they're likely working. The vast majority of them are working full time. The vast majority of them have dependents at home. A not insignificant portion of them are balancing that very difficult life stage between caring for dependents and caring for aging parents. There's a lot going on, and all of that increases the retention risk with the group too. So I think the first step when it comes to persistence and retention with non-traditional students is understanding that they are very, very different than traditional students. And then the second step is looking at our systems and processes through that lens. One of the things that I think is a very, very different service need for this market, traditional students, school is life for a portion of their life. And they're very used to catering to renewing a schedule every single term, new registration, course selection, things like that. And that's just kind of the way we do business. With non-traditional students, the last thing we really want to do is make them go back through these steps every 8 weeks or so, picking up their new course, submitting their new registration, things like that. So it requires that we look at that and say, how can we streamline this for this busy working adult who wants to get this done quickly, and viewing our curriculum, our registration portals, everything like that to make the students have to jump through as few hoops as possible. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I always point out here is, again, with training and the right resources. I think academic advisors are the lifeblood of a lot of our continuing student operations, but helping those teams understand what are the needs of the non-traditional market. And sometimes that can include general life coaching. These students have a lot going on, and if we talk about it with them up front, and we help equip them for the inevitable future where something changes in their personal life, they lose a job, they increase their working hours, etc., you name it. That can cause chaos. And the first thing that's going to get pushed out of that is school. But if we can approach that with them early, help normalize that for them, and help them make game plans, when it happens a couple semesters later, they've got that source of connection and support, and they feel confident connecting with that advisor to have those conversations. And that advisor can further normalize that by pointing them back to the conversations that they have had and their mitigation plan to be able to stay on track.
Mm-hmm. All of these things go to changing the mentality at your institution to make sure that you are in sync. It's not getting the students to adapt to you. It's you adapting to who your prospective students are and will be to be able to make sure these things happen. One example that I love to talk about is Russell Lowry Hart, who's the current chancellor at the Austin Community College District, was the president at Amarillo College. They had huge gains in persistence enrollment because they put the systems in place necessary to make sure that their students could do it. But when he came on board, he asked, what do you need? Recruiting said, we want laptop computers. Well, why? Because our students, first gen, low SES, they're at home. They have to have the conversation with their parents and everybody else. We need to be able to take the laptop out to them to go through the enrollment process rather than make them come to us.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I'm glad you brought up community colleges because a lot of our community colleges have been living in this space of meeting students where they're at for decades. Now we're seeing some of the application to more traditional higher education as well.
Yeah. So we are at the end of our time, unfortunately, because I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Chris, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. 3 takeaways for presidents and boards.
Oh, good question. So I would start with the basic understanding that the needs of the non-traditional modern student are different. And to effectively attract, engage, and retain them is going to take a different practice. Another thing that I would point out is training and development of the people in our organizations and institutions that are primarily responsible for engaging with this group needs to be prioritized. It's a critically important role, and there's a lot of data that tells us that these non-traditional students are influenced by the quality of interactions that they have with the staff. And the third thing that I would think of is just as we're planning your internal operation, understanding what your internal team can do well. And if there's a bottleneck there, really looking to the market because there's so many third-party servicers and providers and partners that, you don't have to build everything yourself in-house. And you can look to some of these partners for that when the time comes.
Well, Chris, thank you. This has been a fabulous conversation for me. What's next for you? What's next for Education Dynamics?
Yeah, well, I think what's next for us is continuing doing what we're doing. We're supporting a number of great schools who are innovating and thinking about how we can better serve this adult student market. And for anybody that's interested in that, one thing I would throw out is I referenced a few times some of the data points that we got from our online student report. If you want a copy of that report, you can get it on our website. If you can't find it there, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or if you can reach me via email, happy to send out that report. But just for traditional institutions that are thinking about better serving this market, it's a ton of great information there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'll make sure that guests can get in touch with you guys if need be. Again, thank you so much. I look forward to another conversation with you in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Chris Gilmore, VP for Enrollment Management at Education Dynamics, and for his sharing with us the differences between enrolling traditional age and non-traditional students, and what you need to fulfill your enrollment pipeline with those type students. Join us next week when we welcome Cassie Sanchez of the Warrior Scholar Project to the program. For those of you who don't know the Warrior Scholar Project, it's an amazing nonprofit that equips service members and veterans for success in higher education through transformative programming that advances skills, builds confidence, and forges lasting connections. Cassie will join us to talk about WSP and how it can help you grow your veteran population at your institution, a population whose demographic is double the regular retention and graduation rate of a typical traditional student. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.